The prairie breathed like an old man in sleep, slow, coarse, and full of dust. It rolled wide and empty beneath a chalk-colored sky, stretching from nowhere to nowhere else. The wind moved low to the ground, lifting dry grass and the bones of forgotten fences, dragging them across the open land like memories no one asked to keep. Somewhere far behind, a hawk wheeled alone, its cry swallowed before it reached the earth. The man riding west had not spoken in days. His coat was sun-bleached, stitched, and restitched by hand. The brim of his hat drooped from old rain. A rifle hung across his back, like a secret long since forgiven, but never forgotten. His name, when it passed through other mouths, was Hart. No first name, no need. Just the kind of name folks said softly, with a glance toward the window. He came down off the ridge just as the light began to fall apart. Evening came on thin and slow, with a bitter orange glow bleeding out of the clouds like rust. Ahead, past a dry creek and a line of stunted junipers, stood the remains of a town no longer claimed by map or memory. 3 buildings with walls still standing, 2 others half fallen, and off to the edge, a chapel, its steeple broken and its white paint now the color of old bones. Hart led the horse into what was once a road and dismounted without sound. He didn't tie the reins. The horse knew him too well to wander. He walked toward the chapel with a limp that wasn't fresh. The front door sagged inward, hanging from one hinge. The inside smelled of ash and wood rot. Stained glass, shattered long ago, left sharp fragments glittering in the dust. The pews were pushed to one side. The altar stood crooked, half-charred, beneath a roof with 2 open ribs where the sky showed through. He stood a moment just inside the doorway, let the silence settle around his shoulders. Then, barely audible, there it was, the smallest shift, a breath that didn't belong to him. His hand moved, not fast but deliberate, toward the knife on his hip. He didn't draw it, just rested fingers on the worn handle, eyes scanning the shadows. The chapel gave nothing in return, but then a sound like linen dragging on stone. He took 1 step forward. The altar creaked. Then from beneath it, slowly, hesitantly, a figure crawled into the dim light. She was young, but with the gaunt hollowness of someone who'd aged too fast. Bare feet black with dust, knees raw, dress torn above the hem. Her hair hung limp around her shoulders, tangled and damp. In her arms, a baby, wrapped in a faded coat tied shut with a length of fraying ribbon. The child made no sound, but its chest rose and fell. She looked at Hart and did not speak, just held the child tighter, her eyes the color of wet soil, wide and unblinking. He didn't move, didn't ask what she was doing there, didn't ask where the father was, or why her lip was cracked, or how long she'd been sleeping under the altar of a half-dead god. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a wool blanket, patched but clean. He walked halfway toward her, slow, careful, and laid it on the floor between them. Then he backed away and sat against the far wall. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the gaps in the roof. Dust swirled in soft columns inside the chapel. Somewhere far off, thunder moaned like a tired dog. Still, she said nothing. But her body shifted, knees folding beneath her, and she lowered herself slowly onto the blanket. The child stirred but didn't cry. She bent her head low and kissed the baby's forehead. Hart closed his eyes. Hours passed that way. Now and then she'd glance at him, quick and furtive, as if measuring the shape of the man she was stuck with. Hart kept still. His eyes tracked the gaps in the wood overhead where stars began to appear, sharp, white, cold. He didn't sleep, not really. Just drifted in and out of the slow, dark quiet. Somewhere near dawn, the child began to cough, a soft, wet sound too deep for a baby that small. She cradled it closer, whispering something he couldn't hear. Not words, not prayer, just sound. A voice trying not to break. Hart stood and went outside. The sky was still black, but the horizon showed a bruise of silver just above the hills. He walked a little ways to the creek bed. found a few twisted limbs of juniper still dry enough to burn, carried them back, and built a fire in the rusted iron stove in the chapel's corner. The girl watched but didn't thank him, just turned the child toward the warmth. When he handed her his canteen, she took it with both hands. "Lena," she said softly, barely louder than the wind. Hart blinked but didn't reply. She hadn't asked his name. He wouldn't offer it. The fire hissed when the wind pushed against the rusted stove door, but the heat inside the chapel held steady. Morning filtered through the cracked boards and slanted beams, falling across the child's face and the woman's hollowed cheeks. The child slept curled in her arms, pink mouth parted, one tiny hand balled into her collar. Lena sat cross-legged on the blanket, coat draped around her shoulders, watching the light climb the far wall like it had someplace to be. Hart had risen before her, but not by much. He was outside with the horse, brushing dirt from its flank with a strip of burlap. He didn't speak to the animal, but his hands moved with the rhythm of someone who had done this before, many times. There was care in his silence, the kind that didn't ask for recognition. The chapel behind him was still too broken for shelter, but it was enough for now. By noon he'd cut more wood, arranged it under the eaves in dry piles, and poured what little clean water he had into a pot beside the stove. Lena had not left the chapel since he found her. She watched him through the missing window pane, cautious but no longer afraid. The baby stirred once, and she pressed it back to sleep with the heel of her hand, then tucked the blanket tighter. Later, she stepped outside, slowly, child in one arm, her other hand against the chapel's doorframe, as if afraid the world might collapse beneath her. "You going somewhere?" she asked quietly. Hart looked at her, then at the horizon, then shook his head. "Nowhere? I haven't already been." Lena didn't answer. Her eyes searched the sky, pale and wide, like something waiting to split open. She sat on the stone steps and nursed the child beneath her coat. Her face had changed in the light, less shadowed but not lighter. Hart worked in silence, fixing the fallen crossbeam above the doorway, nailing a flat board across the window with hands thick from years of rope and saddle leather. She watched him the way someone might watch a dog, part gratitude, part caution. When the baby was asleep again, Lena took her chance. She walked the length of the abandoned town, eyes down, footsteps nearly silent. Two buildings stood upright, an old dry goods store and a tavern that now smelled of dust and something sour. The others were sunken, roofs slanted, doors swinging in the wind like tired sighs. She passed them without stopping. Inside the store, a man sat behind the counter, carving a piece of pine into something shapeless. His name was Ellis, and he looked like a man who never left and never would. He squinted when he saw her, not angry, just remembering something unpleasant. "No work here," he said before she could speak. "No bed?" "Neither." She nodded, wasn't asking. Ellis looked at the child, said nothing. Lena picked up a rusted tin of beans and a packet of sewing needles, then laid them on the counter. Hart's coin paid for them, though she didn't say so. As she turned to leave, Ellis paused his carving. "You the girl from Cimarron Ridge?" he asked. Lena stiffened. Not anymore. Thought that child looked fresh. She didn't answer, and he didn't press. Just went back to his wood, shaving curls onto the floor that would later be swept out and burned. Back at the chapel, Hart was oiling the hinges of the stove. He didn't look up when she returned, just said, "No trouble?" She shook her head. They shared the beans that night, sitting on either side of the fire. The child slept in a nest of cloth beside Lena's hip. Neither of them spoke until the stars arrived. Then Lena whispered, more to herself than him, "He would have been 5 today." Hart didn't ask who. The fire cracked, and the silence closed around them again. In the weeks that followed, a kind of rhythm began. Hart would rise first, tend to the horse, walk the perimeter of the town, and return with firewood or jerky or cloth stolen from a place no one would miss. Lena cleaned the chapel as best she could. Sometimes she sang to the child, but only when she thought he was far enough not to hear. She rarely left the chapel. Once she returned from the dry goods store with her hands balled in her coat, lips pressed thin. "You still got a name here," Hart said that night, more a statement than comfort. "It's not mine anymore," she answered. On the fourth morning, Hart noticed someone on the ridge. A lone rider, not close enough to identify, but too still to be passing through, just watching. By evening, the ridge was empty again, but the feeling remained, like a breath held too long. That night, Lena stood at the broken window, child sleeping against her shoulder. "Do people really say your name in other towns?" she asked. Hart, sharpening his knife by firelight, didn't look up. "Sometimes," he said, "but I don't answer to it." She turned back to the window. "Good." He paused, steel flashing in the firelight. "Why?" "Because if they're talking about you, they ain't talking about me." He said nothing to that, just went back to the rhythm of the blade. Outside, the prairie wind had died down, replaced by a stillness that tasted of thunder. The baby stirred, and Lena pressed her cheek against its crown. Her eyes met Hart's once across the fire, but only for a second, and in that second something unspoken passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of warmth, something slow, the warmth between storms. When the rain finally came, it was not with thunder or spectacle, but with a quiet, steady rhythm, as if the sky had tired of holding its grief. It fell through holes in the chapel roof, weeping into tin pans and empty crates. The dust that had crusted every surface turned to dark paste. For a time, the wind softened. The prairie seemed to bow beneath the weight of something older than memory. Lena stood in the doorway, child pressed to her chest, and watched the rain draw thin silver lines across the earth. Her coat clung to her shoulders, damp at the edges. She didn't shiver. Inside, Hart worked quietly, patching leaks with canvas and tar scraped from an old wagon cover. He'd found it 3 miles west, tangled in the remains of a collapsed supply cart. He hadn't spoken of the ride, nor of the 3 vultures he'd spotted circling something in the grass. The chapel smelled of wet wood, and the soft sourness of milk warmed too long. The stove glowed faintly. A slow boil rose from a dented tin pot, roots and beans, a handful of herbs Lena had gathered from the riverbed after the rain. "Child's got a name?" Hart asked suddenly. Lena turned to him, eyes sharp, not startled, but measuring. She nodded once. "Kale." Hart didn't repeat it, just folded the canvas along a beam and pressed it down with a stone. Later that afternoon, Lena tried again to find work. She entered the tavern, baby wrapped tight across her front. There were only 2 men inside, one asleep with his hat pulled over his face, the other nursing a whiskey like it might change him. The barkeep was a round-shouldered woman named Mags, who had once lost her voice screaming after a fire. She croaked more than spoke now, but she remembered every face that passed through town. "Not you," she said, before Lena even reached the bar. "I'll sweep floors. You'll draw trouble. I don't carry any." Mags leaned over the counter, her face full of heat and old bruises no one ever gave her but life itself. "You came here with a baby and a man no one calls neighbor," she hissed. "You carry more than you know." Lena turned and left without a word. That evening, Hart sat sharpening his rifle, running the cloth along the barrel with slow, measured strokes. She watched him from across the room, the baby asleep in a basket fashioned from an old crate. "Who are they afraid of?" she asked finally. "Me," he said simply. "You?" Hart didn't answer. He opened the breech, checked the chamber, clicked it shut again. Lena looked away, brushing dust from the baby's cheek. "They look at me like I sinned into existence." Hart slid the rifle back beneath the floorboard, covering it with a frayed rug. "You didn't." She studied him, long and quiet. Then stood and walked to the stove, stirred the pot. "What did you do, Hart?" He didn't move, didn't blink. The rain tapped steadily on the wood. "Something I don't do anymore." She nodded. It was enough, maybe more than most got from a man like him. The next morning, a letter arrived at the dry goods store. Ellis squinted at the envelope, turning it over in his fingers. No name, no seal, just inked words on the front. "Looking for a woman with a child." She left before she could answer. He didn't show it to Lena, but he left it on the counter when she came in for flour. Left it where her eyes might fall on it. She didn't touch it, just stared at it long enough for her breath to quicken. Hart knew something had changed when she returned. Her steps were too quiet, her face too calm. Someone from before? He asked that night, without looking at her. She didn't answer, but her silence told the shape of it. Hart sat on the chapel steps as the stars began to stitch themselves across the night. The air had that hollow cold that came after rain. From inside, he could hear Lena humming. It wasn't a song he recognized, just a slow string of notes, rising and falling like breath through wood. He closed his eyes. A dog barked far off, then silence again. 2 days later, the stranger arrived. He didn't come into town fast, rode slow like he wanted to be noticed but not known. His coat was dark blue, sleeves too clean for travel. His boots had shine. A pistol sat on his hip, but not for use, more like a signature. He asked questions in the tavern, bought drinks without sipping them, glanced often toward the road that led to the chapel. Hart watched from the ridge, saw him. That night Hart didn't sleep. He sat by the window, rifle across his lap, listening to the baby breathe. When the child coughed, Lena sat up and held him closer, her back turned. "You ever think about running?" she asked quietly. "Running changes where you are," Hart said, "not what's behind you." Lena rocked the child gently. "He said he'd marry me," she whispered. "Said he'd raise the boy as his own. But when I started showing, his father said, my kind were born to shame. Told him to forget me." She paused. "Then, guess he did." Hart said nothing, just watched the stars. After a long time, Lena looked at him. "What about you? Who'd you leave behind?" Hart didn't blink. "Someone who thought I'd be more than I was." And with that, the quiet settled in again. Deeper this time. Like the two of them, bruised, half-healed, had begun to share the same silence. Outside, the stranger made camp on the edge of town, close enough to come, far enough to wait. The stranger never asked for directions. He didn't need to. The way his horse turned toward the chapel at dusk made clear he already knew what he was looking for. He never approached, not directly. Each evening, he'd ride to a low knoll just beyond the cottonwood trees and sit in the saddle until the sun bled out behind him. From that distance, Lena and Hart were small figures in a broken chapel, sometimes hanging laundry, sometimes splitting wood, sometimes just still. He never raised his hand, never lit a fire, just waited. By the fifth evening, the townsfolk had already started rehearsing the story they would tell, how they'd never seen the girl before, how she brought the child alone, how she found shelter where no one else wanted to look. Ellis stopped speaking to her entirely. Mags looked away when she entered. Lena took to wrapping the child tightly whenever they stepped outside, as if covering him from eyes more than wind. The boy had begun to smile in those quiet moments between chores, tiny, fleeting grins that passed across his face like the sun sliding out from behind clouds. He was beginning to hum when she hummed, to reach for her hair, to recognize the shape of Hart's boots in the dirt, and Hart. He had begun carving a small piece of cedar. No one saw him start. But each evening after the fire dimmed, his hands would move with silent purpose, whittling it smooth. A shape was emerging, slow, gentle. He kept it beneath the stove, away from eyes. That morning, the sky hung low with a copper haze, a sickness in the air that made the birds go quiet. Hart took a long walk east of town, alone. He returned with a rabbit slung over his shoulder and a look that said the man on the ridge was still watching, still waiting. Inside the chapel, Lena was sweeping. She did it without thought, without destination, just the motion, back and forth, the soft sound of bristles over wooden planks, like rain remembered in the wrong season. She paused only when she found something beneath the pews, a dry sprig of white yarrow. Someone had placed it there, recently. It hadn't been there yesterday. She turned to the door and froze. Footprints in the dirt, not Hart's, not hers, a third pair, lighter than a man's but heavier than a child's, circling the chapel, then gone. She didn't scream, just walked outside, child in arms, and stood in the wind until her skin prickled. That night she asked Hart, "If he comes, what will you do?" He was by the fire again, blade in hand, cedar curls gathering at his feet. "I don't keep a past," he said, "but I don't hand over people, either." She sat beside him, not too close. The child slept beside them both, wrapped in Hart's old blanket. The lines around Lena's mouth were deeper now, but her eyes were calmer, as if fear had become something else, less sharp, more woven into her. "Do you believe in shame?" she asked suddenly. Hart paused, set the carving down, looked at her. "I believe in weight," he said. "Some we choose, some we carry." She looked at the child, smoothed the curls on his forehead. "I carried mine out of a farmhouse with blood on my thighs and nothing but a whisper of who I used to be." Hart said nothing, but his hand, rough and still scarred along the knuckles, moved slowly toward the pot on the fire. He poured her a tin cup of broth, placed it beside her on the floor, didn't speak. That was how he protected, in small, deliberate kindness. Later, while the fire dimmed and the wind picked up, Lena asked a final question. "Why carve?" He glanced at the shape in his hand. It had the beginning of a bird, wings not yet opened. "Because some things," he said, "have to be made slow." The next morning, the stranger was gone. No tracks on the ridge, no ashes where a fire might have been. But on the chapel door, tied with horsehair, hung a piece of broken ribbon, the same color as the one that once wrapped the child's coat. Faded red. Hart found it first, pulled it down, studied it. Lena stepped beside him. "He won't come again," she said. Hart nodded. "No, he won't." Neither said more. That day the sun rose through a film of cloud, weak but steady. The boy laughed for the first time, one of those high, accidental laughs that startled even him. Lena wept quietly into her shoulder. Hart watched from the steps, cedar bird held loose in his hand. He didn't give it to her, not yet, but he didn't put it away either. Something had changed between them, not said, not named, but shaped in the silence, not trust, but something older, like the way a tree leans into wind that never stops. The prairie at summer's edge held its breath. The wind no longer wandered. It moved with intent now, low and dry, combing through the grass with long fingers. Even the crows had gone quieter, leaving only their shadows drifting across the dirt, like lost prayers. By then the boy had begun to walk, wobbly and proud, his hands forever reaching for balance in the space between his mother and the chapel walls. He would follow the light wherever it fell, across a windowsill along the outline of Hart's boots, or into the soft golden corner where Lena hung washed cloth to dry. His laughter came in bursts, like birds startled from sleep. Lena had begun to sing again, softly, only when she was alone with the child, old folk songs from a place with more water and less cruelty. She moved differently now, not as if the weight was gone, but as if she'd learned how to carry it without flinching. Hart had rebuilt the chapel's roof. It wasn't pretty, but it held. He replaced the broken crossbeam with one carved from cottonwood, and every morning before the sun rose full, he'd saddle the horse and ride the edges of the horizon, watching for riders, smoke, or signs of whatever the world might send next. Nothing came. One evening he returned with a sack of flour, a handful of apples, and an old brass-handled music box. It didn't play anymore, rusted too deep. But Lena turned the crank anyway, just to hear the faint scrape of metal on metal, the ghost of music. She looked at Hart and smiled for the first time in a way that wasn't small. "You stealing for us now?" "I take what's been left too long," he said. "That ain't stealing." She said nothing more, but when he turned to go, she touched his arm. The baby slept deeper that night. A few days later, Mags from the tavern passed Hart outside the dry goods store. She didn't stop, didn't greet him. But she paused long enough to mutter, "Heard the man's gone north, took money from his father, and vanished." Hart nodded, not asking how she knew. "He ever come back?" she asked. "No," he said, "and that boy, he got your eyes?" Hart looked past her. "He's got hers," that was all. When he returned to the chapel that afternoon, Lena had painted something over the altar wall. Nothing grand, just a thin line of blue flowers, yarrow, and flax, winding like a ribbon above the cracked wood. Beneath it, faint and carved with something sharp, were 3 words, "My only innocence." She didn't mention it, and neither did he. Instead, he reached into his coat and handed her the carved bird, finished now, smooth and curved, its wings half spread, as if caught between rising and falling. She ran her fingers over it, eyes shining with something that wasn't quite joy and wasn't quite sorrow. "You didn't name it," she said. He shook his head. "It don't need one." That night, the 3 of them sat by the fire, the child nestled between them, the bird on the windowsill catching the last light. The flames danced against the stone and wood, casting long shadows that didn't feel heavy anymore. And in that silence, something passed between them. Not a promise, not a plan, but the quiet agreement of 2 people who had stopped running, not because the world had forgiven them, but because they had finally stopped asking it to. Weeks later, Hart was gone. No goodbye, no trail. Just a folded scrap left on the child's blanket. A small sketch of a bird mid-flight. Nothing else. Lena didn't cry. She took the bird carving and placed it on the altar, lit a candle beside it. She and the child left 2 days later, packed what little they had, took the music box, left the painted flowers and the carved words behind. They were seen once, months later, in a town near the Colorado line. The boy was older, laughing. She was asking about work at a schoolhouse. No one remembered their names, but years after, long after the chapel had collapsed and the town had been swallowed by dust again, a traveler passing through found the ruins. Inside, among the fallen beams and vines still hanging on the wall, were those 3 words, barely legible but carved deep, "My only innocence," and beneath it a cedar bird, still whole, still watching, still waiting.